Before power was measured in market share, it was measured in territory. Let's review the ultimate strategists. The highest risk for a successful organization is success itself. Growth creates complexity that eventually kills what made growth possible. This is not obvious to leaders experiencing success. When everything is working, expansion feels inevitable. The path forward seems clear. But history shows a pattern. Expansion contains the seeds of collapse. Rome conquered the Mediterranean. Rome became the greatest power the ancient world had ever seen. Yet Rome eventually collapsed under the weight of maintaining what it had conquered. This is not coincidence. The pattern appears across history. Empires rise through innovation and efficiency. As they expand, they accumulate the infrastructure required to manage scale. This infrastructure becomes increasingly expensive. Eventually, the cost of maintaining the empire exceeds the benefit the empire produces. The organization has become so large and complex that most of its resources go to maintaining itself, not to its mission. This is the danger of overreach. It is not external threat, it is internal logic. Success breeds expansion. Expansion breeds complexity. Complexity breeds cost. Cost breeds fragility. Modern organizations face this risk acutely. A startup is lean. Every person does multiple roles. Overhead is minimal. Growth makes the startup successful. But growth requires infrastructure. More people need management. More locations need coordination. More products need support. Infrastructure accumulates. The organization that was nimble becomes bureaucratic. Decision-making slows. Overhead grows. The cost structure that worked at small scale becomes unsustainable at large scale. But the organization continues expanding. The consequence is predictable. The organization becomes unable to adapt. Competitors, more nimble, overtake it. The organization that was innovative becomes defensive, or the organization fragments. Different divisions pursue different interests. Coordination breaks down. The organization that was unified becomes a collection of fiefdoms competing internally. The stakes are real. Many organizations that dominated their markets became irrelevant because they could not manage the complexity of their own success. Paul Kennedy studied great powers across 5 centuries. His observation was this: powers decline when their global commitments exceed their economic capacity to maintain them. Kennedy identified this pattern in Rome, in imperial Spain, in Victorian Britain. Each was successful initially. Each expanded because expansion was possible. Each eventually faced overstretch. Overstretch occurs when an empire maintains colonies, bases, garrisons, and alliances across territories larger than its economic capacity can sustain. The infrastructure costs more than the infrastructure produces. Joseph Tainter studied collapse more broadly. His observation was that complex societies are problem-solving organizations. But complexity creates diminishing returns. Each addition of infrastructure adds less benefit while requiring more resources. Tainter's argument: a society faces problems, it solves them by adding complexity. This works for a time, but eventually the complexity itself becomes the problem. The organization that was designed to solve problems becomes a problem itself. Most resources go to maintaining the organization, not to solving the original problems. Peter Heather studied Rome specifically. His thesis: Rome's imperial expansion transformed its barbarian neighbors into coalitions capable of overwhelming Rome. Rome created the conditions for its own destruction. The pattern: success breeds expansion. Expansion generates resistance. Resistance requires more resources. Resources are stretched thin. The organization cannot hold. Collapse follows. How does this mechanism work? It begins with legitimate success. An organization solves real problems. It grows. Growth enables expansion into new markets or territories. Expansion requires infrastructure. You cannot govern new territories without governors. You cannot defend without garrisons. You cannot coordinate without communication systems. Infrastructure costs money. Initially, the benefit of expansion exceeds the cost. New territories produce wealth. They provide soldiers. They extend the organization's reach and power. Expansion looks wise, but each successive expansion is a bit less beneficial than the previous one. The easy territories were conquered first. The next territories are harder to integrate and generate less wealth. The infrastructure costs, meanwhile, increase continuously. More people need management. More territory needs defense. Costs rise as benefits fall. The math turns against expansion. At the point where costs and benefits balance, the organization should stop expanding. But organizations rarely recognize this point. Success is intoxicating. Leaders extrapolate past success into future success. The organization continues expanding beyond the point of optimization. Benefits decline, but the organization is committed to maintaining what it has built. At some point, maintaining the empire becomes the primary activity. Most resources go to administration, defense, and coordination. Few resources go to innovation or growth. The organization becomes locked in. It cannot shrink because it would lose its power base. It cannot grow because growth would increase the burden. It is stuck. Meanwhile, competitors have a different structure. Smaller, nimbler competitors without the burden of empire can respond faster. They innovate while the large organization administers. The competitive environment shifts. The large organization, because it is large, cannot respond quickly enough. The organization that dominated now struggles, or internal pressure builds. Different parts of the empire have conflicting interests. Managing the internal conflict requires resources. The organization fractures from within, or the external pressure becomes overwhelming. Enemies that benefited from the empire's expansion are now capable of challenging it. Rome's barbarian neighbors, strengthened by trade and contact with Rome, eventually invaded. The moment of crisis arrives. The organization cannot afford to maintain its empire and respond to threats simultaneously. It must choose, shrink or fail. Most organizations choose to fail rather than shrink. Shrinking feels like defeat. Maintaining the empire feels like holding the line, but maintaining often means collapse. Where does this analysis fail? When the organization can find new sources of wealth, or when it can reduce costs dramatically. If efficiency improves, overstretch might not occur. Another boundary. Some organizations avoid overstretch by deliberately limiting expansion. They choose margin and sustainability over maximum size. These organizations often outlast those that overextend. A validating case, the fall of Rome. Rome expanded until it could not defend all its frontiers. Rome reduced army funding to manage costs. Frontiers were weakened. Barbarians invaded. Rome collapsed. Another case, the decline of British power. Britain maintained a global empire after its economic capacity to do so declined. Britain spent resources on defense and maintenance instead of on innovation. Britain was eventually surpassed by more dynamic powers. Britain's empire was a liability, not an asset. The empire required resources Britain could no longer afford. Important limitation. Overstretch is not inevitable if leadership recognizes it early. Some empires manage decline gracefully by accepting limits and consolidating strength. Also important, overstretch includes moral costs. Rome did not collapse in a vacuum. Rome's barbarian neighbors were not random threats. They were consequences of Rome's own expansion and the instability it created. What are the consequences of overreach? Eventually, collapse. Not immediately. Empires can coast for decades on past strength, but decline becomes inevitable when overstretch is allowed to continue. The collapse is often more sudden than leaders expect. For decades, the organization seems stable. Then some threshold is crossed. Internal or external crisis hits. The organization fragments rapidly. The human cost is severe. When Rome's empire collapsed, millions experienced violence and displacement. Economic collapse created poverty and starvation. Overstretch's consequences are not abstract. The organizational learning is slow. Modern organizations repeat Rome's pattern. Companies grow until they cannot manage themselves. Governments expand until they cannot afford themselves. To the opening question, why does success breed collapse? Because leaders mistake growth for health. Growth is visible and celebrated. Fragility is hidden until it is too late. The organization that recognizes overstretch early and accepts limits often survives longer than the organization that tries to maintain everything. Accepting limits feels like failure, but it is often the key to survival. Rome could have limited expansion. Rome could have maintained a smaller but sustainable empire. Instead, Rome expanded until collapse was inevitable. The lesson is not that growth is bad. The lesson is that growth beyond the point of sustainability is always eventually painful. The leader's question is this: at what point does the infrastructure required to maintain what we have built cost more than what it produces? And what will we do when we reach that point? The modern principle is this: Know the point at which expansion stops being profitable and starts being costly. This point exists. Most organizations ignore it. Measure the cost of maintaining the organization. Compare it to the value the organization produces. When costs exceed value, expansion is creating fragility, not strength. Measure the organization's adaptability. A lean organization adapts quickly. A bureaucratic organization adapts slowly. As you expand, adaptability typically declines. At some point, this becomes dangerous. Measure the organization's margins. Healthy organizations have surplus. They can absorb shocks. Stretched organizations have no surplus. They cannot absorb shocks. When shocks come, they fragment. The uncomfortable question: is our current expansion creating value for the organization or value for the organization's infrastructure? This question separates leaders who see clearly from leaders who are rationalizing overstretch. Some organizations choose to accept the cost of maintaining their size. This is a legitimate choice, but it must be a choice made consciously, not a default. Other organizations choose to limit their size and maintain their agility and margins. These organizations often remain relevant longer than those that expand until collapse is inevitable. The final principle: success is fragile. Growth that generates overstretch is not success, it is the beginning of decline. The leader who recognizes this early can choose a different path. Every empire that expanded beyond sustainability eventually collapsed under the weight of maintaining itself. Modern organizations are not exempt from this pattern. Know your limits, respect them. The throne changes, the strategy remains. Until next time.